Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to come and speak to you today. Returning home is a powerful feeling that I have whenever I come back to Cambridge. In this talk, I want to examine three propositions. The first is that silence is a socially constructed space in which remembering and forgetting happen at one and the same time. It is therefore an important and perhaps indispensable element in languages of bereavement and mourning practices in general. My first subject is silence. In all cultures of which I am aware, reflecting on mortality entails at least an element, and at times a dominant element, of what I would call non-speech acts. Moments when the impossibility of giving meaning to that which undermines or obliterates it informs and infuses the space of silence. The second proposition is that films are many things, but among them is the representation of war. From the very beginning of the cinema, war has been a centerpiece of the genre. And high on the list of what defines war films as a genre is their representation or dramatic staging of organized killing and frequently mass death. I therefore want to suggest that the space of silence in film is very frequently about collective death and about the political meaning of that. The third proposition is that in these filmic meditations on mortality and war, silent films had a major advantage over the later talkies, in that cinematic non-speech acts framed the mourning process in ways rarely, if ever, matched by talkies, hence the title of my remarks, From Silent Film to Filmic Silence. Music and banal dialogue frequently term filmic treatments of this theme into kitsch and worse. By saying less and leaving us to create the words in our own minds, silent film had the power to portray the predicament of men and women alive in the aftermath of wars which took life away not by the scores but by the millions. Cinema, I argue, is a very important source of images of mourning, but those images take on the coloration of the medium and its unfolding discursive fields. I'm looking forward to many things in this conference, but among them is to see to what extent recent cinematic landscapes of mourning are framed by silence. My guess is, and I want to hear what other people have to say, my guess is that silence is a language of mourning in many practices, and in particular in film. To be sure, film has framed mourning in many other ways, and here I want to suggest that there is a second reason why silent film projected a message frequently reduced or ruined in the talkies after 1927. It is that film, during and in the decade after the Great War, captured the power of the séance. Spiritualism was a widespread and common cultural practice in the first half of the 20th century. Its message was reduced roughly to this: those who lost their sons, their fathers, their husbands, and there were 9 million such deaths and scores of millions of mourners, those who lost people in their families could not easily answer the question as to the meaning of the death of their own. Nations do not fight wars, people do. And the notation of serving the nation and dying for it wears very thin, very fast, among families who want to know why their particular husband or father or son had to die. Spiritualism performed this predicament. Families rarely knew the how as well as the why their men had died. The bodies did not come home during or after the war. That was a political decision. And besides, half of the men who died in the Great War had no known graves. Industrial war was a vanishing act, making men die and then disappear entirely. By the way, the same proportion of those who died in the Great War having no trace left was repeated in the attacks on 9/11. Half of those who died, there is not a single trace of them. The same was true for 9 million men in the First World War. Uncertainty and lingering hope of a mistake, which happened many times. Robert Graves talks about reading his own obituary in the Times because he had been lost and presumed dead. Or an incarceration or imprisonment in an enemy camp. The Red Cross spent a great deal of time trying to find people who had vanished. These possibilities, certainly not probabilities, kept families wondering for years, does missing mean dead? And is it surprising, I ask, that spiritualism flourished at a time when the traditional churches, enemies to spiritualism in the West, had no answers for these people? Now, coming together in the presence of a medium, a woman usually, who could channel the brain waves of their loved ones, it made an analogy to radio waves at the time by many people in Cambridge, in particular in the scientific community. Such people tried to still their anguish and to find ways of starting their lives again. The pattern of the message they got through spiritualism and seances was roughly this: the dead return in spirit to comfort the living. We are all right, the message from the dead begins. We are with our brothers who died with us. You, the living, can go back to your lives again. And in most cases, that is what they did. Occasionally, spiritualism and seances involved a judgment. Do the living lead lives worthy of the sacrifice of the dead? And I'll return to that in the film I'm going to show you in a few minutes. In a nutshell, the cinema harnessed spiritualism for profit. In effect, in grand picture palaces and small ones, dozens of war films were produced in the period 1914 to 29, which used silence to translate spiritualism into commercial and artistic success. In a kind of trance in the dark, with or without an organ or piano accompaniment, which allowed for a whole range of possibilities of framing silent film, filmgoers saw the dead return to them, albeit for a moment. When that happened, silence framed the message in a kind of veil which carried emotional and visual force alike. I'm treating silence as a performative non-speech act in which the concerns of a culture are not spoken and speak loudly. It was indeed the voices of the dead which were conjured up in these seances. Consider the paradox, therefore, that when voices were added to feature films after 1927, the effect of calling forth the dead diminished. The reason is, I believe, this is a hypothesis that needs to be further tested, that verisimilitude turned into cinematic pseudo-realism. And pseudo-realism has been the defining feature of war films ever since. I shall return to this point in my conclusion. The existential quest of spiritualism, I argue, turned into existential kitsch. There are exceptions, to be sure. But on balance, my claim is that silent film framed mourning in ways that later films rarely did. Now, I want to show you clips from two films to introduce these arguments. To be sure, a more general treatment of the problem would require much wider filmic reference. But for the moment, let me try to introduce these propositions by using one film which has the inestimable virtue of having been done twice, once as a silent film in 1918 and once as a talkie in 1937. There are very few films that I have found that we can actually say it is the same set of themes, one without sound and one with. And there are other examples that I could refer to, but this is the only one that is explicit in its character. I refer to the film J'accuse by the French filmmaker Abel Gance. But before the clips, I want first to return to the conceptual framework of my argument concerning silence and mourning as a way of expressing why I want to use these particular cinematic moments. Now, in order to appreciate the power of silent films to portray war and mourning through non-speech acts, I want to suggest that we need to revisit the now enormous literature on memory and forgetting. It is an avalanche of literature that has appeared over the last 15 years for reasons that we might discuss later on, not only in film. Mourning is about both memory and forgetting, and I claim silence conveys both. In this way, silent film created an architecture of mourning which tended to collapse with the weight of words and perhaps even more of conventional and romantic music. When I wrote the television series on the Great War and the shaping of the 20th century for the BBC and PBS, I realized, as a historian coming to film, that what carries affect in film is silence. If you want to convey an emotional message, make sure that the script says nothing. It was a technical recognition that led me to the interpretation that I've come to today. So, let us see what dangers lie in ignoring the power and sound of silence. This is the French anthropologist Marc Auger's elegant formulation of the embrace of memory and forgetting. Les souvenirs sont façonnés par l'oubli comme les contours du rivage sur la mer. Memory is framed by forgetting in the same way as the contours of the shoreline are framed by the sea. Parisian elegance at its best. The problem is, it leaves out silence. Auger's topographical metaphor of the seaside is clearly incomplete. We need to see the landscape of the shoreline of remembering and forgetting, key elements of mourning, in all three dimensions. Doing so enables us to observe a vertical dimension to the creation and erosion of the shoreline, which is dynamic, unstable, and at times intrusive. Silence cannot simply be ignored because it is concealed at some moments and revealed at others. It must be examined as part of the cartography of recollection and remembrance. Mourning, I hold, is a space in which we both remember and forget, and silence is a crucial defining element in that space. Silence, I therefore believe, is performative, and this leads to its use in film. The composer, John Cage, said all that needs to be said about the performative nature of silence. It exists in the world and is defined by the world according to certain arbitrary but powerfully reinforced conventions. Those who first heard his composition, 4 minutes 33 seconds, in 1952, were stupefied by silence. What Cage did was to invite concertgoers to come together facing a pianist who sits at a piano and does not touch the keyboard for precisely 4 minutes and 33 seconds. My mother was shocked by this as a pianist. Cage showed them, much to their discomfort, registered on videotape, that silence is the presence of ambient and unintentional noise rather than the complete absence of sound. Silence, I hold, is never equivalent to the absence of meaning. We have to admit that there is another space, that of focused, directed, and purposeful silence, not conceived of as the absence of sound, but as the absence of conventional and socially acceptable verbal exchanges. Silent film presented such non-speech acts and used its own conventions to perform them and to inform them with meaning. Now, the reasons why people choose silence as a cultural practice are multiple, but in my field of research, that of war and violence, I can identify at least 3 impulses underlying the social construction of silence. In the first place, silence is always part of the framing of public understandings of war and violence, since these events always touch on the sacred and on eternal themes of loss, mourning, sacrifice, and redemption. I term these uses of silence, which are, I think, widely used in film, as liturgical silences. They are clearly linked to fundamental moral problems, described in reflections on theodicy, or the conundrum, as to why, if God is all good and omnipotent, evil exists in the world. Such liturgical silences are essential parts of mourning practices in most religious traditions, which create such spaces in their acts of worship, during which not speaking enables those experiencing loss to engage with their grief in their own time and in their own ways. Now consider, for example, a paradox I know well, the paradox that the Hebrew prayer for the dead, the Kaddish, does not mention the word death or dying or grief or bereavement or loss, all conditions or states of mind associated with the 7 days of mourning passed together by families in mourning. The prayer is terrifyingly silent over the critical reality this practice marks, and it is the central, one could argue, the central prayer in the entire liturgy of Judaism. Well, I want to go beyond that and suggest that mourning practices always touch on silence, and because they always touch on such matters, since they perform the fragility of life and the limitations of our own understandings and of our existence. And hence, a conference on mourning and film seems to me to require some serious attention to silence. The second impulse behind the social construction of silence addresses problems of social conflict more directly, and I want to suggest, therefore, that mourning and film is a political matter as well. Silence frequently is deliberately chosen in order to suspend or truncate open conflict over the meaning or justification of violence, either domestic or transnational. The hope here is that the passage of time, not speaking about something, can lower the temperature of disputes about these events or even heal the wounds they cause. I term these practices as yielding political silences or strategic silences, and film has them in abundance. The third impulse behind strategies of silence arises from considerations of privilege. That is, who has the right to speak about the violent past and the wounds it caused? One nearly universal answer is to privilege one group of people who pass through an experience and who thereby have the right to speak about it, as against others who were not there and thereby cannot know and cannot judge. Only those who had been there, so this argument goes, can claim the authority of direct experience required to speak about these matters, and this is what I term essentialist silences. There are many examples of such distinctions. Soldiers frequently speak about their war experiences only to other soldiers. The Israeli scholar Efrat Ben-Ze'ev has studied an annual reunion of the members of a unit in the Israeli army of 1948. These events continue to this day. Well, above all, they share secrets they don't talk about except in that one confined space, and only to each other. This sphere of silence has recently been broken, which is how we know about it. Now, others take an essentialist line in defining experience as internal and ineffable. When I addressed as a young and extremely frightened graduate student a conference, and one I think it was the second paper I ever gave, maybe giving one in King's was even more frightening, but nonetheless, when I was a graduate student 40 years ago, I addressed a conference on the First World War in the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, 40 years ago. It was to open a library in the name of and in the presence of Harold Macmillan, a soldier of the Great War. And in that conference, one of the participants who spoke right after me at the age, I think I was 26 at the time, one of the participants, Charles Carrington, who was a noted author and survivor of the Great War, urged me immediately after my talk, and if someone does this again, I'll be amazed, but he urged me to choose another profession. The reason, he said, and I'll never forget the words, you can imagine the presence of 200 or 300 people honoring Harold Macmillan, a young graduate student in this position. He said to me, "You need to choose another profession. You will never know. You will never know the war. Only we who were there can know what it was like." And it was said with avuncular kindness, devastating though it was. And as you can see, I both acknowledged it and rejected it. Now, once more, I think we can see that silence, or if you will, non-speech acts, have rules. The entitlement to speak about war and violence is in no sense universal. Some have the right, others do not. The difference between the two categories is a matter of social and cultural codes, which can and do change over time. I can give you many examples of that. Now, I want to locate these reflections initially in the period of silent films, when there was a striking and significant coincidence. The post-1918 decade was the moment when the cinema became the central element in mass entertainment. Audiences in the millions, tens of millions, came to films, and made fortunes for their makers and distributors. Blockbusters focused on many kinds of subjects, but war was almost always there. There were comedies and adventure stories and romance and classic films about spies and heroines of the Mata Hari variety. And there were films about battle, almost always staged and completely invented, and films about those who came back from war, and films about those who did not come back. My first point is that film incorporated all three kinds of socially constructed silence: the liturgical, the strategic or political, and the essentialist. And I'll try to show you evidence on this point in a moment. But I would like to add one additional argument at this juncture. It is that silent film limited the power of cinema to claim to portray war as it really was. Silent film could not portray war and knew it. We perhaps are deluded to think otherwise when voices were added. Silent film, therefore, had a major advantage over the false verisimilitude of many talkies. The technological limits of silent cinema in the post-1918 decade were, I argue, one of its greatest strengths. Being unable to imprint voices on nitrate scrolls, filmmakers had to rely on facial expression, gesture, and silence to convey meaning. In doing so, they produced both films of quality and films evidently without redeeming features at all. Not all silent films captured the point I'm making by any means. But what they could not do was to portray war and death in war in a manner which would convince viewers that they were there, that they could imagine war, that they could live it imaginatively. That leap of imagination is both erroneous and dangerous. No one could know what the Battle of the Somme was like. No one could know what Verdun was like, or the 12 battles of the Isonzo in eastern Italy. No one in a film theater could smell decaying flesh, human and animal alike. No one could smell fear or pain or anguish, and consequently, no one could know what war was really like. Silent film stopped short of this supererogation of our capacity to see, to imagine war. The illusion of being there was truncated. And I hold, thank God for that, since after the talkies came, war films have been the agents of sanitization, trivialization, and indoctrination based on their presentation of reality. Talkies made war thinkable, easily imaginable, and therefore doable. Now, I want to stop abruptly short and make it clear that you know I'm doing that from advancing the absurd hypothesis that the advent of the talkies was one of the causes of the Second World War, though there are students of Leni Riefenstahl's work that have gone some way towards that argument. Not me. Once we stand back, we have to admit that there is a real question left as to how, after the unprecedented butchery of the Great War, the idea of having another one became thinkable. To be sure, Hitler made it hard to do anything other than think about this question, but one of the striking features of war films from then until now is how few of them project an unequivocally pacifist message. Very few. There are exceptions. They are notable. Remarks All Quiet on the Western Front was something to talk about. And I think even more powerful, certainly as a film and as a moral statement, one of the greatest films ever made, Kon Ishikawa's The Burmese Harp, which was made twice, once in black and white and once in color. They are orchids, I would dare to claim, in a field of weeds. Most war films make a case for war, consciously or unconsciously, and the use of sound helps them do it. It may be a case for adventure, excitement, masculine bravado, but it's a case nonetheless. All right. I hope I have established something about the nature of silence and the nature of silent film and its meanings. Now let me turn to the second part of my talk today on the contrast between the representation of war in silent film and in talking films. And I want particularly for this conference to talk about the representation of mourning and of the presence of the dead in the imaginary of the living. In choosing the two films I'll just give you brief clips of today, I'm in a privileged position because there are very few films that were made first as a silent film and then as a talkie. There are many war films of romance and adventure which were made and remade, but virtually all remakes were talkies. Not so in the case of the French filmmaker Abel Gance. And I cite him here because he was a master of silent film and one of the great innovators of the cinema. His silent film Napoleon, 1927, has technical wizardry of a kind few could master. And in Gance's case, mastery is not at all the word when he tried his hand at talkies. Melodrama turned into kitsch. I want to show you that at the speed of sound. And I suspect that was built into the way he used film to project his ideas about mourning and sacrifice. I want you to just think of this contrast today between these two war films with the same title and the same moral purpose. The first was made in 1918, just at the end of the Great War, and then edited, and you'll see a little bit of the added material in July 1919. It started off as a propaganda film and then it got totally out of hand. The French army lent Gance soldiers to tell his story of the nobility of the fallen, whose sacrifice went far beyond the knowledge or the recognition of the families for whom they had fought and died. Together with the poet Blaise Cendrars, Abel Gance conjured up a moment when the dead returned home. The scene is a reverie, or possibly a moment of madness, we're not really sure whether it actually happened, told through the warning given by the soldier poet Jean Diaz, played by Séverin Mars, to the men and women of his village in 1918. The message is, the dead are coming back. They rise from their graves, we'll see that, to confront their families and to find out how loyal have their wives been, how brotherly their neighbors, how dedicated their sons to tend the fields, the herds, the businesses. And what do you think they find? They find normal, frail, limited, and very guilty human beings. This moment of the return of the dead is a deathly warning to the living that mourning entails a debt, a terrible debt, and one that could not ever be repaid. The fallen had given everything. And what can the living give in their turn? Here is j'accuse as accusation indeed, but its accusing finger points out the moral imbalance between those who suffered agonies beyond our imagination and those for whom they died. Only by living upright lives and abolishing war, making it anathema. This is a film that became a propaganda device for the League of Nations in the 1920s. Only by abolishing war would the dead be able to sleep again. Thus spake Gance. Now, I want you to have a look at a very short part of this story. It is set in 1918, and one of the oddities of this is that a number of the units that were filmed to present the dead were sent back into the fighting at the end of 1918, which was a very bad 100 days battle to end the war. And the dead became, the living who became the dead in film became the dead again. There are ironies that abound in all of this. There will be a scene that shows the victory parade in July 1919 that was added for the League of Nations propaganda, and it'll show the défilé, the march through the Arc de Triomphe, only happened twice in history, of living, led by the gueules cassées, the people with disfigured faces, the men with broken faces, and the dead on top of them. The notion that mourning in war entails the presence of the dead is overwhelming in this film. And I want you to see how Abel Gance framed it through silence, if you please. The first clip. This is film added in the reproduction. There's no film at all. Music added in the reproduction. 1919. I think that's enough. We can stop it now. You'll see there's 6 or 7 of these scenes of judgment that follow it. All of them involving this confrontation, the dead overlooking the living, that they have the capacity to see the indignities and moral limitations of the living. This reversal of judgment, that the dead are there all the time, is something which caused this film to have an extraordinary success. And it was shown in 17 countries, and the best viewing figures I have for it is it had between 13 and 14 million viewers between 1919 and 1921. Now, the important point about it is that the sound you had is simply the reproduction. You have to think of it as silent. And I have 3 dossiers of reports about the use of silence in the presentation. It's not yet. Not yet. Can we turn that off? There we are. Right. You're going to hear a second film in a moment, which is J'accuse, remade by Abel Gance in 1937, this time outside of the conventions of silent film. In 1937, at the height of the French Popular Front, really just at its end, and of both the Spanish Civil War and the Japanese dreadful, murderous invasion of China, Gance remade J'accuse. Now, many of the scenes, the names, the individual, Jean Diaz is still there. He survived accidentally, purely haphazardly. Many of the relationships of the first film, many of the people in it are repeated. But this time, the danger is that war will return, and therefore the living have failed the dead of the First World War by allowing war to rear its murderous head again. Now, veterans of the war, the one survivor, Jean Diaz, the poet, the prophet, the Christ figure, were lining up to stop it. And other veterans were lining up to fight a Second World War. Only the dead could stop them through their emissary, their prophet of doom, Jean Diaz, the one survivor of a suicide mission, killing all of his unit but him on the very last day of the war in 1918. Now, he's about to be buried with his comrades, but someone hears his moans and he's lifted from the grave. Therefore, he is a man with a mission to ensure that the dead are not forgotten and that war will not come again. The debt to the dead is to make war anathema. He invents, as a scientist, an impenetrable glass uniform rendering soldiers untouchable by weapons and holds it in reserve to be used against corrupt politicians who want to betray the dead and go to war once more. But another veteran, an industrialist, steals the design and gives it to the politicians, who then use it for the ends Diaz had hoped would never come again. The only course left to him is to call back the dead to rise once more. He returns to Verdun, that iconic place in France with its lugubrious watchtower, an all-seeing beacon surveying the hundreds of thousands of graves of French and German soldiers who died there. He stands beneath an enormous tower, which is the cover, really, of a huge ossuary of bones of French and German soldiers who could not be identified in any other way. They are still there to be seen if you visit Verdun today. This time, there at Verdun, he repeats the moment of the earlier version of the film. He brings the dead back to life. The dead march home again, and even though Diaz is killed by a patriotic mob, he too joins the dead, marches into eternity, having defeated war once more, and now you know why there was not a Second World War. It is Abel Gance's attempt to say that the power of the dead is the only thing that can inform the moral life of the living. I want you to look at this way Gance created this message in sound and compare it to the first. Now, it is a little critical. I do feel that the comparison is one showing Gance at his best with Gance not at his worst, but in another register. But I want you to think about the difference when the same theme is framed not by silence, but by romantic kitsch. Please. This is the ossuary of Douaumont.
des autres qui vous parlent, qui vous crient. Les hommes vont recommencer à se battre. J'appelle au secours. Il faut que vous m'entendiez. Il le faut. Je vous appelle. 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 Alors, devant levez-vous. Je vous appelle. Vous allez certainement coucher dans la guerre. Appelle. And that I called you. I should sit down and be paid to sit on suicide. C'est ma femme. Levez-vous. Je vous appelle. Tué par la guerre, je vous appelle, aviateurs de tous les ciels, tués par la guerre, je vous appelle, artilleurs, sans vaccin, cavaliers de tous les pays, tués par la guerre, je vous appelle, les 12 millions d'amis, tués par la guerre, vous sortis les hommes, sous la règle, l'âge depuis 20 ans, levez-vous, tous, les vivants veulent recommencer la guerre, je vous appelle, je vous appelle.
I think you've seen enough to realize what's happening. The dead from the whole world appear and converge to make war unthinkable, to bring the presence of the dead to bear on the moral lives of the living. That is the same theme, done this time without silence. In conclusion, my claim is that silence gave Gance's 1918 apocalypse a dreamlike quality, a séance-like quality missing in the 1937 version of the film. Give him music and wind and sound effects and the works and the poet's declamatory posturing. We wind up, to my mind, unmistakably in the realm of kitsch. The boundary I'm drawing is not a fixed one. There were preposterous elements in both versions, to be sure. Sound multiplied them, and thereby created a realm of cinematic kitsch, in Saul Friedlander's term, a tasteless, perhaps secondary kind of inferior art, reducing treatments of death and war to the banal, certainly, and sometimes to the obscene. We can talk about the reception of the film later on, but the character of it and the way it frames mourning is the point that I want to draw to your attention in the context of this conference. Let me therefore try to see if I've established the claims made out at the outset of my talk. First claim is that silence has its own conventions. It is a socially constructed, performative space in which remembering and forgetting happen at one and the same time. Silence is a powerful register in a number of domains, one of the most important of which is that of mourning and bereavement. War films in the first decade after 1918, presenting many images of a central motif of a generation in mourning. Cinematic mourning, if I may use the phrase, entailed a visualization of the return of the dead, one at a time or all together, which drew its power from the very silence of the medium, sorry for the pun, and enabled men and women to address the impossible questions haunting them. What did it mean? For what did they die? Why had a generation of young men vanished? Now, I put it to you, if you walk around this town or any other in England, you will find attempts to attach meaning to loss of life in war. The college war memorials are all there, just a few steps from here. Even the King's Choir Christmas Carol service that is broadcast every Christmas Eve and on Christmas Day emerged in 1919 as a war memorial of the Dean of King's College who had served, a preservation of the nobility, the simplicity of the lost generation. My claim is that silent film addressed this need and these questions as to meaning and performed its unanswerable and yet unavoidable mysteries. Later war films tried to do the same, but most collapsed under the weight of the market and the medium. Pacifist films were almost always a financial risk, and consequently they can be counted on the fingers of one or both hands, but no more. Therefore, I simply want to leave you with this one thought. Silent films may be at least the equal of the filmic silences and lies which dominate the war film industry of our times. Private Ryan, in Spielberg's film of the same name, a film with real power and very real limitations, asked his wife in the film, at the end, in a graveyard of soldiers who died to save him, to tell him, asks his wife to tell him that he was a good man, that there was a meaning in his living while others died. Spielberg, without knowing it, I believe, returned to his cinematic forefather, Abel Gance, with this question. And by doing so, he reminded us that war and death and the plight of those who mourn the fallen have been essential elements of film history since the invention of the medium. These films touch questions on which silence is a delicate, complex, and appropriate response. As Maurice Blanchot once put it, to be silent is still to speak. And the speech of silent film, I argue, has a depth and a force later films rarely attained. Now, in these all too brief remarks on film, mourning, and silence, perhaps the best way to paraphrase my interpretation, briefly, is to say that when cinema confronts war and the human toll of war, in other words, mass death, when cinema confronts mass death, perhaps silence is the better way. To paraphrase Wittgenstein, of that which one can never speak, thereof one should be silent. I look forward to the rest of this conference to hear the silences embedded in our subject and the silences essential to the film history we all share. Thank you very much.